I spent 7 years at his bedside, washing his hair, adjusting his pillows, learning the rhythm of his breathing. But the day after his funeral, they showed up with boxes and told me to get out of their father's house. The reality of it hit me like cold water. My kindness had been cataloged as convenience, my loyalty mistaken for weakness. I could feel every lonely night and every canceled plan sharpen into one clear, furious clarity. My name is Margaret Ellis, and I am 64 years old. Before I share how they lost everything because of their own greed, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic people always get the karma they deserve. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to the quiet years, the long days, the invisible labor, and the small mercies that became a life. I met Edward when I was 56. He was kind in the way that made you trust him without thinking, patient, a little forgetful in the way of gentlemen who had worked hard and softened with time. We married in the soft light of an autumn afternoon, small ceremony, close friends, and a promise to care for each other in sickness and health. We meant it. I meant it in every way I knew how. Within a year, his Parkinson's symptoms began. At first, it was small things. His hand trembled while stirring coffee, a slow slur to certain words. I learned the little maps of his days, which boots were easier for him to put on, how the cold would make his hands clench, how the quiet of the kitchen at 3 a.m. was when his mind wandered most. I rearranged my life around his needs. Friends who had been Saturday lunches shifted to polite texts. The community choir I loved dwindled as my hours did. I paid the bills on time, learned to navigate medical jargon, sat through appointments and trials and pills that did not help. I did not resent the loss of those things at first. Love makes you give without thinking, and I gave. Edward's children, Daniel, Karen, and Michael, lived hours away. They texted occasionally with the occasional shrug of obligation. Thinking of you. Sorry we can't be there. Call us. They visited, once each maybe, often when Edward's condition seemed easier, once to see him when he looked like himself, then not. The long, slow grief of years wasn't dramatic. It was a toll booth of missed birthdays, postponed visits, and a calendar full of doctor's appointments where I was the only one to arrive. I watched them put their lives ahead. Not all parents expect their kids to move in. Not all adult children owe round-the-clock care. But a daughter or son showing up once in a blue moon meant a lot to him. He deserved that, and so did I. Financially, Edward and I had built a modest life. He had saved, invested conservatively, and we had the house, a big colonial with a wide porch and a garden he loved but rarely planted in his last years. The house was more than wood and brick to me. It was the container of his memories, the place where I fed him warm soup on rainy afternoons and read to him in the evenings when his voice grew thin. Sometimes, alone at night, I would replay the sound of his laugh and wonder why the adult children who claimed to love him had chosen distance over the slow ache of presence. There were moments that cut, small things that felt like salt. Karen once called on his birthday and asked if she could pick up some of Dad's things, and when I said, "Of course, but perhaps next weekend," she sighed and hung up. Daniel stopped answering my texts for months, and then sent a list of Dad's remaining belongings that read like an inventory of entitlement, not grief. Michael showed up at holiday gatherings, looking at the house as if it were a stage set for his convenience. I swallowed the hurt because I had been taught that family comes first, and that the first job of family is to keep peace. Still, I never once neglected Edward. When his cells rebelled and his legs trembled and the world grew smaller, I became his map. I learned how to lift him without hurting him, how to feed him puree with dignity, how to sit with silence without letting it swallow me. I took nights at the hospice, hours at the pharmacy, troves of phone calls at odd times. I canceled vacations. I forgave missed birthdays. I created a life that orbited around his care, quietly proud that we had each other in those final chapters. If I had any expectation of reciprocity, it was not money or grand gestures. It was simply that when the end came, the children who called him Dad would at least show up to hold his hand, to say goodbye, to love the man who had raised them. That is not too much to ask. I had been ready to step aside, to let the children step into their roles. But the cold truth was that the door they thought was theirs was already held open by me, and they had never tried to come in. The funeral was a small, quiet thing. We had no grand displays. We had friends who knew us, a few neighbors, the hospice nurse who had become a friend, and me, carrying the weight of 7 intimate years. The service was gentle. I spoke about his hands that had once planted lilies and the way he hummed while making coffee. There were tissues and subdued condolences. I walked out of the chapel feeling both hollow and strangely lighter, the kind of lightness that comes after long, heavy labor. I thought that the cruelty of those who had been absent would be tempered by the presence of others. I was wrong. The day after we buried him, the morning sunlight in the living room felt too bright, dragging into view the edges of our life. I had plans to meet with the attorney to finalize a few small estate details, to sign one more paper and close some loose ends. I was still in my black dress when they came. They arrived like they belonged. Daniel, tall and raw with resentment, pushed through the gate with a cardboard box under his arm. Karen, with her perfectly set hair and an American silk voice that carried a rehearsed grief, stood behind him. Michael came last, face pinched, looking like someone who had rehearsed outrage in the mirror. They carried more than boxes. They carried the surety of people who believed life owed them. "Margaret," Daniel said, dropping his box onto the porch with a thud, "you need to start packing. This is Dad's house. You knew he had kids." His tone was the tone of entitlement, not a son grieving, but a customer demanding service. I remember the small images clearly, the way the afternoon sun fell across the mantel, the golf trophy halfway hidden behind a photo, the faint smell of lemon cleaner in the hallway. I could feel the house watching me, like a living thing noticing an injustice. Karen walked in as if she owned the space, fingering the lace on a doily. "We came by to help him get his things sorted, Margaret," she said. The help was a performance. "We thought we'd move a few things out, settle the place, put it on the market. There's a realtor already lined up." She smiled at me the way you smile at a stranger in a line. I opened my mouth to explain the months we had spent together, to plead for even a sliver of decency, but Daniel cut me off. "You shouldn't have set your things up here like this," he added, as if I had laid my life down without permission. "You knew he wanted his family to have this. We shouldn't have to be asking you to leave." Their words were knives, because beneath them lay a presumption they had carried for years, that the house, the love of a life shared, was theirs by right. The years of my presence, the nights of vigil, the appointments attended, all invisible to them. There was a confidence in their arrogance, as if the world owed them what they had been promised. I was expected to fold into the background, to be the polite, forgettable woman who smiled and swept and served until she was replaced. For a moment, grief and fury collided in my chest. I felt small and then enormous. The quiet order of my life shattered, and the truth of my invisibility flashing like lightning. They stood there with their boxes and their carefully curated grief, certain that their arrival spelled the natural order of things. "The house is part of Dad's estate," Michael said. "You can't just be here." I didn't cry, I didn't shout, I made tea. There's a strange power in the ordinary. While they were performing the role of aggrieved rightful heirs, I went to the kitchen, boiled water, and sat at the table with the same quiet hands that had lifted him from bed 1,000 times. I poured the tea, the kettle singing a small, defiant song. They waited in the living room, confident in their plan. The clock ticked toward a moment they thought was their entitlement manifest. When they were done with their speeches, when their entitlement had worn itself thin, I set a cup on the table and reached for the stack of papers I had from the attorney. I had signed them only days earlier, after the long, whispered conversations that had seemed practical then and revolutionary now. I placed the certified copy of the updated estate planning documents in front of them like a calm finality. Daniel snatched at the folder, his face losing muscle as his eyes scanned the pages. Karen's hand covered her mouth. Michael's jaw tightened. "This is a copy," Daniel said, trying to laugh. "Where's the original? This is some kind of joke." "It's certified," I said. "Edward and I made changes last month. He wanted everything in order. We signed with the attorney on Thursday. It is all here." My voice was steady. The world narrowed to paper and ink and the legal weight of truth. "And you," Karen began, as if my carrying out of years of love was a theft. "I carried him," I said simply. "I loved him. The documents are clear." The humiliation in the room was audible, not mine, but theirs. The arrogance that had seemed absolute crumpled into stunned disbelief. They were not prepared for the quiet dignity of a woman who had known what loyalty meant and who had the paperwork to prove that loyalty had been acknowledged. They rifled through the papers, their privileged certainty turning to fury. "You can't do this to us," Michael snarled, but there was something breaking in him, an awareness that perhaps they had been counting on my silence and my disappearance. Daniel's voice rose. "We are his children. You can't erase us." "I didn't erase anyone," I said, and the honesty felt clean. "I followed the choices Edward and I made together. He asked me to look after him to the end. He asked me to make sure I would be taken care of. That's what I did. You weren't there." Their entitlement was a hurricane. They spoke faster, louder, each accusation a way to cover the hollow space where real grief should have been. They tried to call me names: manipulator, home stealer, opportunist, as if the word wife and the years I had given meant nothing beside their convenience. In the end, their plan was not a plan at all. It was hope dressed in outrage. They had expected me to fold, to cry, to beg. When none of that happened, the only weapon left was the assumption that possession equaled right. They were wrong. When the lawyer left the certified documents with me that morning, I remember the way the light made the ink look like something permanent. It felt like a small justice, but my heart didn't do cartwheels. There was no gloating, only the cool clarity that comes after grief has been handled with both hands. The anger that rose inside me was not about the money or the house. It was the accumulation of small betrayals, the missed visits, the unread messages, the way they had cataloged my devotion as something temporary. I sat in the kitchen while they argued in the living room. Outside, the garden that Edward had loved sighed in a breeze. The world was ordinary and cruel. I thought of the long nights, of the meals I warmed and the hands I smoothed. I had given everything without complaint. When the time came to be protected by the choices he and I had made together, they wanted to rewrite history with loud voices and cardboard boxes. I could have called the police the moment they demanded I leave. I could have screamed until the sun set. But I did none of those things. Instead, I made another cup of tea and thought about boundaries. For years, I'd allowed myself to be the safety net for people who never realized they were walking on thin rope. I'd been the caregiver who covered for others' complacency. Now, the last thing I wanted was to become a cautionary tale about enabling. The awakening was quiet. It wasn't a single lightning bolt, but a dawning, a recognition that love does not mean being erased, that loyalty does not require self-abnegation. I thought about the practicalities, too. Edward had asked me to be taken care of. The documents honored that request. I had access to funds that would let me choose my next chapter. I would not let their fury decide the terms of my life. So I did two things. First, I called the attorney and explained that their presence was causing a disturbance. I asked for advice, and he told me calmly to remain where I was and let the legal process prove itself. Second, I made a decision about what I would no longer provide. For years, I had been the emotional and logistical fallback for people who did not value me. I chose that day to stop being available to their manipulation. When the attorney called the police to explain the legal standing of the estate, I felt something lift. That afternoon, 2 officers arrived at our door with polite, practiced faces. They read the paperwork. They did not take sides in the kind of way the heart desires, but they had a job, and the law was clear. It took only a few formal steps for them to inform Daniel, Karen, and Michael that they could not remain on the property without the owner's permission. They had expected me to bargain. They had expected tears or cheap sentiment or some combination of apologies and promises that would placate them. Instead, they found a woman who had moved from grief into reason. I did not threaten. I did not retaliate. I let the law do its work. There was dignity in that, the dignity of letting truth stand on its own. Packing boxes were left by the porch. The stepchildren argued in the driveway, loud and small, while the officers stood by, firm and neutral. I watched them go through stages, indignation, then impatience, then the hollow calculation of people whose plans had been built on assumptions. Daniel tried to storm back twice, as if sheer force could rewrite ink on a page. Each time, an officer quietly asked him to step back. It was almost surreal. The same men who had once looked at me with suspicion now found themselves literally pushed out of the frames they believed were theirs. When the last of them left that afternoon, the house felt enormous, heavy with all the things that had been. Yet there was a strange peace in the rooms. The absence of their voices was like a wound beginning to scab. I sat at the kitchen table and let myself breathe. No dramatic confrontation, no public spectacle. Just a woman who had done what she needed to do to carry herself into a life she had been promised. After they left, some of their spouses and friends called, furious and conspiratorial. "You could have at least given them a room," someone said. "They were your husband's children." I listened politely and chose not to be lured into argument. The boundary I had set was not negotiable. I had loved, I had cared, and I had signed papers that protected the life my husband and I had chosen. They had disappeared when their duty became inconvenient. I was not obliged to sacrifice the rest of my life for their arrogance. That night, the house was quiet in a way it hadn't been in a long time. I walked through rooms filled with echoes, and I acknowledged the cost. Grief had its own timetable, and healing its own rules. Setting a boundary does not make you cruel. Sometimes it is the last humane act a person can do to themselves. If there is a merciless kind of quiet, it is watching people realize that the future they've been spending has been borrowed from someone else's loyalty. The week after they were forced off the property, the repercussions rippled outwards in ways that were almost mechanical, like dominoes set up on a table by people who assumed the table would always hold. They had made plans. I knew because Daniel had bragged once about the business loan he would finally be able to secure once the house sold. Karen had been planning a lavish move closer to the city, with a mortgage premised on an expected inheritance. Michael had emptied savings into a startup, with promises that their father's estate would cover a shortfall. Those conversations came back to me like recordings. None of them had expected that the papers would actually be signed. When the will was recorded and the house was not immediately put up for sale by the heirs, whispers became calls. Daniel's investor backed out when they learned there was no tangible security. Without the expected equity, his small company couldn't make payroll, and a vendor took them to collections. Karen's realtor called to say the pre-approval had lapsed. The bank wanted further documentation she couldn't produce without the inheritance she had counted on. Michael found his partner reconsidering the partnership. The safety net had vanished, and so had investor confidence. The legal reality was not my revenge. It was cause and effect. They had built a structure on a single assumption, that time and loyalty would be theirs for the taking. When that assumption dissolved, everything built on it was unstable. Panic replaced entitlement. Calls that had been full of demands turned frantic as they realized the options had narrowed. They had no one to blame but themselves. I watched from a distance, not out of malice, but because it was safer for my heart. I had been the one to supply the muscle when their plans faltered, to offer a couch or a meal when the economy rolled the dice and failed. I had been their invisible safety net. Now the same people who had once rolled their eyes at my ceremonies of care found themselves on the phone to landlords, banks, and disappointed lovers. The cruelty of their own choices found them quickly. Karen's long-awaited move stalled when her fiancé, who had thought of their life as a step away from security, chose to walk away when the mortgage numbers shifted. Daniel's business, which had never been stable, folded under pressure. Michael's startup investor, sensing instability, withdrew. I heard rumors of repossessors, of weddings postponed, of friends who were suddenly too busy to be hospitable. Karma, when it behaves like arithmetic, can be brutal. They tried various strategies. Daniel called me the second week, a voice raw and small, claiming he'd changed, pleading for help. "We made mistakes, Margaret," he said. "Can't you just help us with a loan? A little until we sort things out?" I listened, and the ghost of a soft-hearted woman who wanted to patch the world rose in me. But I remembered the boxes on the porch, the words tossed like knives, the way they had refused to be present when it mattered. "Daniel," I said carefully, "you were absent when Dad needed you. You were absent when we needed help. I can't fix the past. You have to live with your choices." My voice was not cruel, only final. They grieved their misfortune the way privileged people grieve loss, public, loud, then private and panicked. They called their friends, hoping reputations and sympathy would translate into opportunities. Some friends offered small gestures, a job lead, a loan of a mattress, a referral. But the larger scaffolding they had expected, the financial cushion of an inheritance, the social capital of being an only child entitled to a house, was gone. In the vacuum, their weaknesses became visible. Old debts reappeared, creditors reasserted themselves, romantic promises dissolved under pressure. I felt a strange, complex compunction watching this unfold. I did not hate them, not really. I hated the choices they'd made, the ways they had been absent. Their suffering did not restore what I had lost. It was merely a consequence. There was no glee in it for me. Rather, there was a slow, cold satisfaction in the fairness of the world aligning with the truth. You cannot take without consequence. Meanwhile, the house, our house, became the source of stability. The estate sold in a steady, unflashy way. The buyers were a young family who loved the porch and the garden and promised to plant the lilies Edward had always liked. I did not sell it out of spite. I sold it because I needed to step into a life that matched my new reality. I did not need the burden of a big house anymore. I needed something manageable, warm, and mine. When the sale closed, I breathed like a woman who had been underwater for years. I paid off small debts, closed accounts that had been in Edward's name, and then I did something I had not allowed myself to do in a long time. I planned for joy. It felt almost mischievous, like a secret between my heart and the future. They came back, of course. Once the immediate shock of their loss settled into the dull ache of daily life, a new impulse took hold. Repair. Daniel sent long emails that read like memoir confessions. Karen called and left messages at all hours, alternating between resilience and tearful regret. Michael showed up at my doorway 6 months later, shoulders hunched, eyes avoidant, and offered apologies that smelled of convenience. They wanted forgiveness, and they wanted resources. It was as if they had not truly believed consequences would stick, as if my capacity for mercy had been a bottomless well. I listened with the same careful attention I had once paid to their father when his speech slurred. Hearing them was part of my recovery. I needed to see them own the ways they'd failed. But owning is different than absolution. When they asked for money to patch their finances, or for a place to stay while they got back on their feet, I declined. Not because I wanted them to suffer, but because the healing I needed required me to refuse being their safety net any longer. Forgiveness does not require restitution. Boundaries do not make you unkind. The quietest revenge is often the healthiest choice. Refuse to return to the role that harmed you under the guise of loyalty. I forgive you, I told Daniel when he sat across from me one rainy afternoon, genuinely remorseful. But I will not enable you. You need to live with your choices and build another way. I won't take responsibility for what you spent with an expected future you didn't earn. He looked like a man who had been cut free of a habit and discovered a hole in himself. The realization was brutal, but real. Karen cried and said she understood, though I think sometimes people conflate understanding with convenience. Michael promised to change, only to relapse into old patterns a year later. They called periodically, more out of habit than love, and I answered politely but guardedly. The door between us was not slammed shut, but it was bolted with a firmness that spoke of self-respect. My life after them was not a parade of victory. There were quiet afternoons filled with loneliness, days when the ache of the empty side of the bed resurfaced with the tide. But there were also blessings in the small freedoms I reclaimed. I sold the large house and bought a cozy townhouse in a neighborhood where the trees were close enough to whisper secrets to the windows. The townhouse was manageable, intimate, and had a small deck where I could keep a few pots of herbs. I started to do the things I'd postponed for years. I signed up for a watercolor class at the local community center and discovered a patience I'd forgotten I had. I joined a book club that met on Tuesdays and traded grief stories for gossip about improbable plot twists. I reconnected with friends who had been patient and kind, the kind of people who showed up not for obligation, but out of shared affection. I planted a small border of lilies in a borrowed corner and watched them unfurl. One afternoon, not long after the sale, I sat on my new deck with a cup of chamomile and a book. The sky was a soft blue, the kind that flattens petty urgencies into background noise. I felt the weight of years lift gently, not all at once, but like a tide. I did not celebrate anyone's downfall. I celebrated my right to choose home and peace and slow mornings. I was not unkind to my stepchildren in the ways that counted. I had refused to be erased, and in doing so, I taught them in the most practical way the cost of absence. They would occasionally post family photos on social media. Staged smiles, children in twinning outfits, vacations paid for with newer, humbler currency. Once, months after I'd moved, Daniel sent a message. "I hope you're well. We are trying. Sorry again." I read it, thought of the man who had seemed to take the world for granted, and I replied simply, "I am well. Be well." The healing that followed was not dramatic. It was a braided thing, friendship rebuilt, small joys found, grief honored without letting it define the future. I learned that boundaries could be tender and fierce at once. I learned that loving someone through illness does not mean you owe the world to people who chose not to show up. I learned how to let go of obligation and pick up the loose ends of my life. On warm evenings now, I make Edward's tea the way he liked it. 2 spoons of sugar, a slice of lemon sometimes, and I sit on the deck while the sun leans into the horizon. I don't think about the boxes on the porch much anymore, not because their story didn't matter, but because mine matters more. I have friends, a small garden, and the soft audacity of a life rebuilt. If revenge must exist, let it be quiet and just. Let it be the lawfulness of a certified document and the clear-eyed refusal to let others determine your fate. Let it be setting a boundary that protects your peace. The men and women who assumed they could take what they wished learned a lesson that cost them their convenience. I, meanwhile, found my way back to color and music and light conversation on a warm Tuesday night. So if you are watching this from your living room, if you have loved and been taken for granted, know this: protecting yourself is not cruel. Loving yourself enough to step away is not disloyal. The world has a funny way of rearranging itself when people finally stop carrying others' entitlement for them. I am not vengeful. I am simply enjoying the life my husband and I planned together, one careful cup of tea at a time.